Hello everybody and welcome to the All About Film. I should say the much awaited and requested All About Film for Kodak Portra 800. This video looks at how to use Portra 800, as we're going to call it, how it talks about the film's characteristics, provides some technical details, and lots of sample images that should help you understand how this film performs. Portra 800 is a fast color negative film available in 35mm and 120 formats. It's processed in C41 chemistry. Alright, before we get too far, let's start by taking a look at the first page of the datasheet, and let's take apart the technologies that Kodak uses in Portra. What I've got here is, on the left, it's their technology, and on the right, it's their benefit. Literally, it is their word copied and pasted from the PDF into an editable format. Anyway, so like I said, this is copied and pasted from the datasheet and shows how some of the film technology benefits the final images. And I'll let you read through these at your leisure, but to my eye, as we see in the sample photos throughout this video, what we have here from the datasheet is a decently good recitation of film performance with little to no marketing shine, as we call it. This really does just feel like it's straightforward and was put together by some engineers who understand what they've made and why it's good for photographers. Kodak rates Portra 800 at, well, this won't shock you, 800 ISO, and I shot it almost exclusively at box speed, asterisk. There are going to be a handful of photos throughout here that show, for instance, flowing water, and also some that have that were done in a studio drop box with a black background. The flowing water photos will have been overexposed by around 2 stops or so, and then developed normally. And so this is an 800 ISO film, yes, but it handles over and underexposure remarkably well. Some of the softbox studio tabletop black background images were shot probably around ISO 1250 to 1600 and then developed normally. For my preferred format for this film, it is definitely 120. The larger format reduces apparent grain in the final images, and the color depth and trueness do appear much better. I know it's the same film stock, but when you have a larger image area, you have more space for the image to have color depth and trueness form over the space of that negative. Now, that latter point about color depth and trueness owes to the greater amount of film area used to record those tones, colors, and contrast. One thing it would be nice to have from Portra 800 is a sheet film option. Yes, 800 ISO is hard to use in a large format camera in full sun, owing to the far slower shutter speeds afforded in large format. But as a studio C41 film in sheet format, Portra 800 would be really hard to match. It would allow for a lot of lower light use and things like that, which could make for softer and more natural lighting that is just a little bit easier for people to work with when they're sitting in front of a camera. So my best tip for getting the most out of this film is not to obsess over overexposure. If you need to throw too many photons at this film, go for it within reason. Don't expose it at 6 ISO. But I definitely multiple times gave it around 2 to 2.3 stops too much light, and it didn't really cause significant issues in the final images. For underexposure, a few of my shots were underexposed, and Portra 800 handled it well. And in fact, Portra 800 handled underexposure better than any other C41 film that I've used so far to date, and I've used a lot of them. All of them? No, not quite. I think there are 2 or 3 I can think of I haven't used yet. So Portra 800 has a very good exposure latitude, and it can handle both over and underexposure very well. So the tip for those is you don't have to worry about being absolutely precise with your exposure settings when you're using this film. If you have any sort of modern SLR, you're going to be just fine. For subjects that work best with Portra 800, people are this film's primary target. We know that from the name, by the way, Portra. And from the datasheet info we saw above, the datasheet opens, that's literally the very first page of the datasheet, with indications that Portra is designed to reproduce natural skin tones. So if you want to use this film, really put people in front of your camera, that's where it's going to deliver the best results. Grain on medium format is pleasant and complements images and subjects well. For medium format, the grain provides a pleasing visual texture that feels kind of like velour for your eyes. On 35mm, however, I find the grain to be more like sand for the eyes. The image detail is there, and the grain, sand's not a fair comparison because the grain isn't harsh, but it's more of a dominant image characteristic. Tonality and tonal range are subject to a limited extent on format and to a larger extent on lighting. Interior and artificial lighting will truncate your tonal range to a noticeable extent in some settings. To that end, this film really works best with full spectrum light, and that's worth considering when you use this for shoots with controlled lighting. Acutance is a hair on the soft side, and that's likely intentional because softer acutance is favorable to portrait subjects. As a portrait-oriented film, softer acutance would be more flattering for this film's intended subjects, so the acutance in this film aligns with the intended subject use. Contrast is very good across image types. Images with relatively flat-toned scenes have suitable contrast with some variation in the contrast range. Subjects with stark contrast can retain both shadow and highlight detail. Sharpness is a bit soft to my eye, but again, like acutance, that flatters the intended subjects. Basically, for example, where Ektar really shines for landscape work, it isn't always ideal for portraits. However, Portra 800 truly shines for portraits, and it somewhat falls apart for landscapes, and that's especially true on 35mm. The dynamic range is fine, but shadows do tend to get clipped before highlights when you experience clipping. Digital conversion is, honestly, it's quite good, which stands to reason because Kodak does a lot to ensure that their films digitize well. All right, here's the spectral sensitivity curves, and this is a really interesting spectral sensitivity curve to me. You get a little bit higher in the warm tone, but realistically, what you're seeing here are the three primary tones, being red, green, and blue, reddish, greenish, and bluish, we'll call it that, being relatively even peaks. I mean, the difference between those, all three of them are hovering in the 2.7 to 2.9 range. In terms of those peaks, that's relatively flat at the peaks. And even the valleys of those, which are, let's call that 2.1 to 2.2, that's not a huge amount of range. And what's interesting is the way that that's reproduced in the images to me, because the image color coming out of Portra 800 does really seem very well balanced across the entire visible light spectrum. Kodak does not provide reciprocity failure data for this film in their datasheet. I feel like that's something they don't do in any of their films. Anyway, so the best advice I have for you is to experiment with a roll of 35mm and take detailed notes for your tests. Record the frame number, the lighting conditions, and exposure data such as time and aperture. You can also try a few filter colors in that test roll and record that data, and then find a combination that works for you and your use, which will likely be something like astrophotography, star trails, overnight cloud motion, or nighttime landscapes and cityscapes. Basically, just make sure you carve out some time before you do a real shoot to test out a roll of film with different times, lightings, and filters, and then just go with the frames or the frame setting. When you have the frames, you compare your notes to the images you get back, and just pick the frames that look the best and use the settings that those had to replicate when you go to do your real photo. Now, as we touched on in the tips, Kodak indicates that Portra 800 has good development latitude, and my use over the past, 7 years. Yeah. Wow. Supports that. Here are samples of outdoor work that were overexposed and some indoor shots that were underexposed. The exposure variance from box speed would have been around 2 to 2.3 stops in each direction, maybe a hair less on the underexposed images. So as you can see, all of them returned highly usable finished results. There's not really an image in these that screams that it was over or underexposed. None of them look like they were accidentally misexposed. And what that means is that when you are actually using this film, especially if you're using a 35mm or 120 camera without a meter, it's going to be really forgiving. It also means that if you're out in a setting where, yeah, Sunny 16 should be 1/800th of a second, but you want to use 1/1000th of a second and you want to try to get away with, say, f8, you can probably do that. I mean, I did quite a number of times, in fact. I started using Portra 800 in January 2016 and wrapped up the photos for this video in January or February, actually, 2023. Portra 800 has given me photos from a lot of different subjects in different lighting and different conditions, and generally, I've been pleased with it most of the time, but I definitely have a strong preference with this film for some subjects and some lighting. People and animals in daylight work very well to my eye. Similar subjects in warm artificial lighting can be recorded decently well. Landscapes and similar subjects don't really benefit from the Portra 800 look, and that's a matter of personal aesthetic perspective. Portra is a specialist film, and what it does very well. It's not great as a generalist, and many subjects don't benefit from what it offers. That said, portraits, weddings, events, animals, and other photos where the subject has a face will generally be rendered well on Portra 800. Also, if you take Portra 800 out of its environment, it can perform fine, but not to the best that it can be. So, it's sort of like a heart surgeon could probably perform a kidney operation, but it's not truly that heart surgeon's wheelhouse. So Portra 800 is a specialist, and it likes being where it's strongest.